This video is not about proving that every vegan is perfect, pretending every person has the same access to food. It is not even really about Billie Eilish as a celebrity. This is about what happens when someone acknowledges animal suffering, exploitation, environmental destruction, and then admits it's not necessary, and then spends the rest of the discussion building emotional, rhetorical escape routes around the implications, creating an echo chamber. That is the real issue. He calls logically emotional vegans boring, then continues using extreme emotional responses not grounded in science, fact, or logic, empiricism, and consequentialism.
I don't really give a fuck. I think if you really care, like if you're someone who's genuinely getting fucking angry, like, oh, it's like ruining your day, you're just a boring individual. Like, go get a grip.
This is the same person that criticizes Joe Rogan and then does the exact same thing. Not veganism as a personality, not celebrity hypocrisy, not internet drama. The issue is acknowledgement without integration. Veganism is not a demand for moral perfection. It is an ethical framework centered on reducing avoidable harm where practical and possible. There's a problem with spreading disinformation to a large echo chamber when it empirically is causing harm and then hides behind a following. Having a following doesn't make you right. There's a problem with criticizing people like Joe Rogan and then doing the same exact thing and then hides behind anti science. You can tell a lot about someone's reasoning by what they admit before they start defending themselves. In this video, Janky does not actually deny the most important vegan points. He admits the industry is horrible, animals are treated terribly, meat is not necessary, admits vegan arguments can be compelling, and admits he probably does not value pigs enough to stop eating them. This is exactly why this response matters. The anti vegan argument here is not built on science, it is built on discomfort, selective skepticism, and it is built on taking parts of the evidence that are impossible to deny, then emotionally refusing to follow the implications. That is not empirical reasoning. That is cognitive dissonance with a mic. Simply saying that someone is wrong because you disagree is the least scientific and smart thing you can possibly do.
Meat is inherently wrong. And then the other thing is two things cannot coincide. I love animals. I love all animals so much, and I eat meat.
I don't think it's cancelable either, but I do think that it's just a wrong opinion. I think it's just a wrong opinion.
He calls it wrong before he establishes why it is wrong. This is the first pattern. The ethical claim appears, the discomfort appears, and then the dismissal arrives before the argument does. Dismissing something before looking at why, how it is wrong is performative
Performative bastard.
and is an emotional statement. Before anything else, separate the messenger from the claim. Billie Eilish can be hypocritical. She can be inconsistent. She can criticize billionaires while moving through billionaire spaces. She can criticize environmental destruction while participating in celebrity consumer systems. All of that can be true, but none of that proves that factory farming is ethical. None of that proves that animals do not suffer, eating animals is necessary, and that the vegan argument is false. A hypocrite can still be right. A smoker can tell you cigarettes cause cancer. A billionaire can correctly say poverty exists. A person who fails to live by a principle can still state a true principle. So when the conversation becomes entirely about Billy's contradictions, that is not a refutation of vegan ethics. That is a transfer of scrutiny. Instead of asking, are animals being harmed unnecessarily? The conversation becomes, is Billie Eilish morally pure enough to say this? Those are different questions. A major pattern throughout the discussion is reframing veganism as though it claims moral purity or absolute perfection, even after the framework itself is repeatedly clarified as harm reduction rather than perfection.
Around the world, there's a there's an environmental harm to a lot. It's like, the private jets and stuff. But she doesn't need to be in the same way you don't need to eat meat to. She said AI is harmful for the environment, which it obviously is, yet only 2 weeks after she shared edits of her male version, which were made using generative AI. Got male Billie Eilish, and then we got Billie Eilish posting a story about how AI consumed more water this year than the global bottled water industry. This is the thing. You can't complain about criticisms like this when you are so, powerfully convicted in your opinion about veganism.
So, first off, veganism isn't an opinion, it's an objective fact based on consequentialism and empiricism. This is the least smart thing a person can possibly state while using emotional statements. AI has nothing to do with veganism. Being a hypocrite about AI has nothing to do with veganism.
If she actually cared, she could get those contracts broken. Well, if she cared as much, then she probably just wouldn't. She wouldn't she wouldn't sign the contracts to begin with. Like she's promoting these companies and then speaking out against them. It's just fucking confusing. It's
which is the exact same thing he's doing about animal agriculture. Some of these critiques may be valid as critiques of Billy. They are not valid as arguments against veganism. That distinction matters because if you cannot separate the truth of a claim from the imperfection of the person saying it, then you are not doing an analysis. You are blindly, emotionally reacting. Animal ag causes more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation sector. She can still use transport and produce less emissions than Jenko. You are doing reputation management, selling emotional validity, confirming your echo chamber, pandering. Veganism is empirically grounded with outliers, that means exceptions, yet he dismisses everything as opinion. The framework is built around empirically observable harm reduction and practical limitation, yet it gets rhetorically framed as a subjective opinion or moral absolutism. It is not. The real argument is not do meat eaters feel affection? One of the biggest rhetorical pivots in the video is around the word love.
variables here. Like, what do you mean by love animals? Obviously, eat meat. You know what it mean. You know what eat meat means.
Do
But what do you
you?
mean by love animals?
So this sounds reasonable at first. Words do matter, definition matters, but watch what happens. The argument gets moved away from the material harm and into semantic fog. The strongest vegan claim is not that meat eaters are physically incapable of feeling affection towards animals. Part of what sustains the contradiction is psychological outsourcing. Most consumers never directly confront the killing itself. The violence is industrialized, hidden, packaged, sanitized, and emotionally distanced before the consumer ever encounters it. If the average person had to personally kill, bleed, dismember, and process the animals they consume every day, many of the emotional contradictions around loving animals would become much harder to psychologically sustain. If dogs and pigs process comparable sentience, emotional capacity, suffering capability, social bonding, and intelligence, then selectively assigning one category family status while assigning the other food status is not rooted in objective moral difference, but in cultural conditioning and arbitrary hierarchy. The stronger argument is this: can you claim universal love for animals while materially participating in systems that confine, exploit, and kill them when it is not necessary? That is the semantic question. This is an ethical consistency question, and Denki accidentally gets closer to the truth than he realizes.
animals and still eat meat. You just don't love the animal enough to not eat them.
Exactly. That is the concession. That is the whole point. The affection exists, but the affection loses to appetite, habit, convenience, culture, and preference. At a certain point, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. Love is not merely verbal affection. Love is reflected through behavior, protection, moral concern, and unwillingness to inflict unnecessary suffering. If someone claims to love animals while simultaneously supporting systems that confine, exploit, mutilate, and kill them unnecessarily, then the word love begins to lose coherent meaning. The issue is not whether affection exists. The issue is whether affection without moral consistency is ethically meaningful at all. Most people would immediately recognize the contradiction if applied to dogs. He doesn't. The emotional inconsistency only becomes normalized because culture separates animals into categories like pet, livestock, food, or companion. But the suffering capacity of the victim does not fundamentally change because the category label changes. So the question becomes, what kind of love permits unnecessary harm when avoiding that harm is possible? There is also an important distinction between survival and preference. A person stranded in a survival situation may kill an animal while still feeling grief, moral weight, reciprocity, or tragic necessity. Love does not necessarily mean absolute nonviolence under every conceivable condition, but industrial consumer systems are not survival situations. The overwhelmingly majority of modern consumption occurs through convenience, habit, taste preference, normalization, and emotional distance from the suffering itself. The deeper contradiction is not simply killing. It is participating in unnecessary systems of suffering while treating the victims as emotionally disposable enough that the loss no longer meaningfully registers. That is where the conversation should go. Instead, it keeps getting pulled back into definitional ambiguity. What does love mean? Can you love some animals and eat others? Can you love fish and eat fish? That may sound nuanced, but functionally it works as an escape route. Because once love means anything, it becomes ethically useless, which is why he constantly pivots and uses semantic diversionary rhetoric. Reminds me of Jordan Peterson saying a Bible isn't a Bible, it's a corpus, even though they're the same thing. The most honest moment in the entire discussion is when the species hierarchy becomes explicit.
Love is a strong word. I probably don't love pigs, but I like them. I think they're cute, but just I don't value their lives enough to have a moral aversion to eating them.
Then you just don't love them, period. This is important because a lot of anti vegan rhetoric tries to avoid saying the quiet part clearly. It hides behind protein, nature, culture, annoying vegans, and plants feel pain, even though they don't. But here, the actual structure becomes visible. The issue is not whether pigs suffer, cows feel pain, chickens have stress responses, or industrial farming is cruel. He already admits that the industry is horrible. The argument is I know they suffer, but rank their suffering low enough to continue participating. That is speciesism. And here is why this inherently leads to his bigotry and ableism. And the moment moral worth becomes conditional instead of intrinsic, the framework becomes dangerous beyond animals. If he's being consistent enough, because history is full of systems that justified unequal moral treatment through intelligence, utility, productivity, capability, hierarchy, or perceived superiority. So once suffering alone is no longer enough for moral concern, the question becomes who gets excluded next? And honestly, that is a more coherent anti vegan position than pretending suffering does not exist. Because once you admit that, the debate changes. You no longer get to pretend this is only about science. Now it is about moral hierarchy. Now it is about which beings count, how much they count, and how much suffering human preference is allowed to override. That is the real philosophical battleground. If being logically consistent, which he hates the disabled people, which is a factual statement because he uses hate speech against the disabled and then pretends disability rights shouldn't matter. So, according to him, moral value is determined primarily through intelligence, capability, utility, dominance, or hierarchical worth. Then that framework can logically reduce the moral standing of disabled people, cognitively impaired people, children, or anyone deemed less capable. They're fundamentally the same. Frameworks based on hierarchy and conditional worth do not stay neatly contained. Once suffering alone is no longer sufficient for moral concern, the logic can extend far beyond animals. Dominion specifically covers this. It's a slippery slope to fascism, as it's the same argument that's been made against the disabled, race, and sex for thousands of years.
But I promise you that if animals could speak for themselves, they'd be a lot less polite than me or even Billie Eilish.
Okay, all right, sure.
He doesn't even understand sentience and consciousness.
That's not how it happens. They know, they literally know, and the evidence is clear to anyone who witnesses it.
So who's going to know this? A former slaughterhouse worker or someone that can't do a single fact check? This comparison shows he doesn't understand sentience even. His response indicates that because a species can't talk, there is no way to indicate a motive to live. So if logically consistent, he'd argue against killing people against body language because they can't verbally say it in a language he understands. One of the strangest parts of the discussion is how veganism repeatedly gets framed as just opinion, even though major world health organizations and decades of nutritional research already establish strong empirical grounding for plant-based diets. Fact. Processed meat is classified by the WHO/IARC as carcinogenic, like cigarettes. Excess red meat consumption is repeatedly associated with increased cardiovascular disease risk and higher all-cause mortality.
I don't think there's much evidence that vegetarian or vegan diets are inherently healthier. I think
We can pull it up.
they can be, but like a lot of that shit is also pretty bad for you.
As well as other things. Diets centered around legumes, grains, vegetables, and fruit and fiber repeatedly correlate with improved long term health outcomes across population studies.
Wow.
He even admits this in a previous video 3 months ago, contradicting himself, proving himself wrong, which is why you should not listen to him. He is a lying hypocrite. That does not mean every vegan diet is automatically healthy. Oreos are vegans, sugar is vegan, ultra processed vegan food exists. But the existence of unhealthy vegan foods does not erase the broader empirical evidence surrounding well planned plant based nutrition. The issue is that the discussion repeatedly treats empirically grounded nutritional patterns as though they are merely ideological opinions, while normalized consumption patterns avoid equivalent scrutiny, acknowledgement without integration. This is the spine of the entire video. Denke repeatedly acknowledges the premise while also changing the topic.
Obviously, I'm morally averse to like the very horrible way that they're treated. Like the industry is fucking terrible. And like the insemination and the forced pregnancies, it's fucking horrible.
These are not small concessions. These are the core premises of vegan critique. The industry is terrible, animals are treated horribly, and the suffering is real. Then later,
You don't need meat. Just eat beans.
and then his previous video 3 months ago, which proves he's a liar.
Or, you know what? This is actually like genuine advice for people who don't have a lot of money. Buy beans. You really don't need to eat that much meat. Like, you don't need a lot of animal produce to live. You just need beans. If there's one change I could make to most people's diets to make the world healthier, it would be more beans and less meat. I feel like a lot of people have been tricked into thinking that every meal needs some kind of animal product. It's like, no, man. Beans are so healthy. I know the Hispanic audience watching are giving me a fucking standing ovation right now, but I'm right with you guys. Beans are energy efficient, they're cheap, they're filled with protein, they're filled with nutrients. Rice and beans is essentially poor man's cooking in every country on the fucking planet. For good reason. You could live basically off of different variations of rice and beans and maybe a little bit of veg. But a lot of the time that veg is in the rice and beans. Like onions are a great source of vitamin C, and if you don't like onions or you're allergic, then you can use like a bell pepper or something. And if you want to get really frugal, then you could even use the liquid inside the cans of beans. You know, that liquid is packed with fiber and nutrients and sodium. Like meat is very because meat is incredibly expensive, even in like developed countries like America and the UK, because there's a go-between, but like when you purchase meat, because the animals live off of plants. So you could just buy the plants, which would be cheaper, because the plants don't really live off of many resources that can be bought and eaten, whereas animals is like, that's like a second, I don't know how to phrase it exactly. There's a layer in between. So it'd be cheaper just to use that layer. If there's one thing that any of you take from this video, like students or whatever the fuck, go look up some recipes for some nice bean-based recipes and enjoy, because beans are delicious. Fuck it, go make some chili. It's so easy, it's so cheap, it's so quick, and it's very healthy. You don't even need rice or cheese or anything. Just a bowl of chili, you're sorted, man. And you can make like 4 days worth of it at once as well.
So this is important in proving intentional lying and harm that he's causing. Notice how quickly the framework changes. Beans are cheap, nutrient-dense, survival food, poor man's food, and eaten globally. Right until veganism starts threatening normalized consumption, then suddenly it becomes elitist, white, privileged, unrealistic, and impossible. Which is racist, by the way, for bringing race into veganism. The standards move depending on which conclusion preserves comfort. That is another major concession, because once you admit animals suffer, the industry is terrible, and meat is not necessary, the ethical pressure increases, the issue becomes unavoidable. If the harm is real and the harm is unnecessary, why continue defending it? That is where the argument should become sharper, but instead the implication chain gets interrupted using emotion-based reasoning. The discussion shifts to Billy's hypocrisy. Notice how he changes it constantly from food prices, private jets, AI, billionaires, child labors, indigenous huntings, and definitions of love. Some of those topics matter, but they do not erase the core chain. None of those have anything to do with industrial animal agriculture and common settings. Suffering exists. The industry is terrible. Meat is not necessary. That is the contradiction slash lie. The facts are accepted intellectually, but emotionally quarantined before they can produce a conclusion. That is not science, that is compartmentalization. Most people do not sustain meat consumptions by constantly confronting suffering. They sustain it through distancing them.
Why did Billie Eilish just spam post a bunch of animals getting abused like that was gonna solve something? You just traumatized like thousands of people.
So if you hire a hitman, you're not responsible. Distance from slaughter, blood, confinement, fear, screams, separation, and death. Meat arrives as branding, packaging, convenience, fast food, and supermarket products, not as visible violence. That psychological distance is a part of what makes contradiction emotionally sustainable. The child labor comparison. One of the most common anti vegan moves is the everything is unethical argument, therefore do nothing.
So are you not allowed to love children if you wear clothes? Because a lot of clothes were manufactured by child slaves, like abroad.
I'm so confused as to where you're going with this.
Are you not allowed to love? Are you not allowed to love chocolate? Are you not allowed to love children if you eat chocolate?
This is crazy.
Does eating chocolate? Does eating chocolate?
That is cognitive dissonance. He realizes what he's saying doesn't actually make sense because he already knows that veganism isn't about perfection. This is something that Joe Rogan does as well, which he criticizes on. It says you are complicit too. Your clothes may involve exploitation, your chocolate may involve exploitation, and your coffee may involve exploitation. Therefore, you do not get to criticize meat. But that does not logically work. The existence of one unethical supply chain does not justify another. If your clothes are produced through child labor, that is also bad. If chocolate comes from exploitation, that is also bad. That does not make animal suffering irrelevant, especially when it is avoidable. It just means capitalism contains multiple systems of harm. The correct conclusion is not because harm exists everywhere, stop caring, or because you can't be perfect, continue doing immoral acts you don't have to. It's like arguing for crime simply because perfection isn't possible. The correct conclusion is reduce avoidable harm where you reasonably can. This distinction matters because reframing harm reduction as perfectionism creates an impossible standard where any imperfection becomes justification for continuing avoidable harm. It's like someone being a singular murderer simply because serial killers exist. Well, I'm not a serial killer, so it's not bad. Veganism at its strongest is not saying become morally perfect. It is saying stop participating in unnecessary animal exploitation where it is practicable and possible. The distinction matters because Denki keeps treating veganism like it demands absolute purity when the stronger version is about reducing avoidable harm. The core tenet of veganism is reducing harm where possible and practicable. How is that perfection? If he would have done a simple search on what veganism actually is instead of pulling a Joe Rogan, 80% of his misrepresentations would not have been possible in the first place, and he knows this.
But Eilish's statement was clearly directed at the average consumer.
Right here, it states at 6 minutes. After he says it's directed at the average consumer, he constantly changes it to things that don't have anything to do with animal agriculture, like it being a white take because of indigenous cultures. Also, how are indigenous cultures using the internet and watching a Billie Eilish video? But then again, this person doesn't believe in logic.
But Eilish's statement was clearly directed at the average consumer, not at indigenous groups that hunt animals.
And then later on, he does the exact thing in the video he's watching.
Is a privilege. Not everybody has that privilege, and that is another reason that this is a white take. Number one, many
You see, you got a good picture?
communities
And see how he just agrees blindly, even though he just watched a video that says.
But Eilish's statement was clearly directed at the average consumer, not at indigenous groups that hunt animals.
And then also, and by the end of the video, he's watching a video about indigenous hunting that the guy pointed out has nothing to do with the average consumer.
Like genuine advice for people who don't have a lot of money: buy beans. You really don't need to eat that much meat. Like, you don't need a lot of animal diets to make the world. Every meal needs some audience watching. I give kind of animal product. It's like, no, man, beans are so healthy. I know the Hispanic audience watching are giving me a fucking standing ovation.
Well, clearly, it's not a white take, according to his own words. Accessibility argument is real. This is where the video needs to be fair. Not every anti-vegan argument in the transcript is weak. The accessibility argument matters. However, it brings race into veganism when race has nothing to do with it. There are also tribal vegans.
Like, not eating meat and like strictly having a vegan diet is very fucking difficult for a lot of people, especially in America right now, where like financially it's pretty tough at the minute. Like, currently it's rough.
It's not. He's lying.
Like, genuine advice for people who don't have a lot of money: buy beans. You really don't need to eat that much meat. Like, you don't need a lot of animal produce to live. You just need beans. If there's one change I could make to most people's diets to make the world healthier, it would be more beans and less meat. I feel like a lot of people have been tricked into thinking that every meal needs some kind of animal product. It's like, no, man, beans are so healthy. I know the Hispanic audience watching are giving me a fucking standing ovation right now, but I'm right with you guys. Beans are energy efficient, they're cheap, they're filled with protein, they're filled with nutrients.
The cheapest vegan products are cheaper than animal agriculture products. So this is untrue. There are disabled, low income, rural, and food insecure vegans globally, some of which don't even have transportation, which complicates the claim that veganism is inherently elitist, like he says. Large population studies and cost analyses have repeatedly found that staple plant based diets centered around legumes, grains, vegetables, and basic whole foods are often cheaper than diets heavily centered around meat. They also all have protein, well, except for rice maybe, but they all have protein. That's where the animals get their protein. What people frequently imagine as vegan food are specialty processed replacement products rather than the inexpensive staples that sustain much of the global population. My mom and I are disabled and vegan on food stamps with no transportations. You can use food stamps for delivery for places like HEB. In a lot of countries, meat is a privilege due to it requiring more water than just plants. Again, in a lot of countries, meat is a privilege. The issue is not whether barriers exist. The issue is treating edge case barriers as universal absolution. Because these poor people, which I am not, can't go vegan, then neither do I, even though it doesn't apply to them. They use it as a universal absolution, or sorry, excuse. Another important distinction is that many consumers defending industrial meat systems are not personally operating within the edge cases they invoke. A wealthy, non indigenous consumer purchasing factory farm products through ordinary convenience culture is not ethically equivalent to a subsistence hunter or someone surviving inside a genuine food desert. Those realities deserve serious discussion, but they do not automatically universalize across all consumption.
Like genuine advice for people who don't have a lot of money: buy beans. You really don't need to eat that much meat. Like, you don't need a lot of animal produce.
Selectively framed, or a lie, I guess, after previously saying 3 months ago the complete opposite, stating that, but I'm right with you guys, beans are energy efficient, they're cheap, they're filled with protein, they're filled with nutrients, thus, it's not an elitist stance. Rice and beans are essentially poor man's cooking in every country on the planet for good reason. Like onions are a great source of vitamin C. This is where it's confirmation bias and intentionally misleading.
Is a privilege. Not everybody has that privilege, and that is another reason that this is a white take.
Okay, I'm black. What am I supposed to do now?
Number one, many communities, which are almost never predominantly white, have never had their infrastructure invested into, or it has been intentionally torn down, and so they live in food deserts. Those people do not have the options that you have, especially not as.
That's actually not true. It's not. Most people do have the option. It's actually a minority that don't have the option. If we're talking in places like United States where she lives and who she was speaking about.
A celebrity, millionaire, maybe billionaire. Even if there are options, so many people are not able to physically get to those options. And even if they can get there, so many people do not have the option to buy anything other than what is the cheapest and what is on sale.
And that would be plant-based foods. Plant-based foods are almost universally the cheapest, especially in America. So earlier in the discussion, beans and rice are explicitly framed as cheap, nutritionally viable staple foods used by poor communities all over the world. He literally describes rice and beans as poor man's cooking in almost every country on the planet, then directly associates that framing with Hispanic audience. Then said,
Healthy. I know the Hispanic audience watching are giving me a fucking standing ovation.
I know the Hispanic audience watching are giving me a standing ovation. But I'm right with you guys. Beans are energy efficient, they're cheap, they're filled with protein, and they're filled with nutrients. So the contradiction or lie becomes obvious. Rice and beans are framed as globally accessible, nutrient dense, protein rich survival foods until veganism becomes associated with ethical implication. Then suddenly the framing shifts towards privilege and practicality and cultural disconnect. The rhetorical shift is important because veganism itself is not a racial category. It is an ethical framework centered on harm reduction towards sentient beings where possible. So it's common sense that tribes are not expected to go vegan. No one's going up to these tribes and telling them they should go vegan. No one. A reciprocal subsistence hunting culture is not the same thing as industrialized factory farming. It's a false equivalence. Treating them as interchangeable collapses materially different systems into one category. The issue is not discussing cultural or economic realities. The issue is that the standards change depending on whether the conversation threatens normalized behavior. If rice and beans are acknowledged as cheap, sustainable, globally accessible stable foods earlier in the discussion, then reframing vegan diets as inherently privileged later becomes inconsistent. It becomes a lie.
Very real, very concrete socioeconomic issues with veganism. Using myself as an example, I have the ability to get tofu from Aldi's, Harris Teeter, Sprouts, Food Lion. I have.
So this is empirically invalid because vegan tenant is reducing harm where possible. So it's common sense that all tribes can't be common, that all tribes can't be vegan, but there are vegan tribes. Food deserts exist, poverty exists, disability barriers exist, transportation barriers exist. Some people do not have the same grocery access, time, money, kitchen stability, or nutritional education. But if they, you could argue that since they, if they have access to internet, then even that's not an excuse. This matters. Any vegan argument that ignores material conditions becomes detached from reality and isn't actually veganism. It's like a Christian saying that worshiping the devil is Christianity and vice versa. The vegan framework already accounts for this through the phrase where practical and possible. The existence of barriers does not invalidate the ethical principle itself. But here's the distinction: accessibility problems complicate individual moral blame. They do not make industrial animal agriculture ethical. They are not the same claim. A poor person buying what is available at the only nearby store is not the same ethical situation as a wealthy or average person defending factory farming out of preference. A disabled person with limited dietary options is not the same case as a commentator distorting marginalized edge cases to protect normalized mass consumption and climate accelerationism. So, yes, accessibility matters, but accessibility cannot be used as a universal shield for everyone, because when someone does have options, the ethical question comes right back, which is why he keeps pivoting. If you can reduce harm and choose not to, then the argument is no longer about food deserts, it's about comfort. What's easy, popular, what makes money, and confirms existing uneducated biases in his echo chamber. Reciprocity is not factory farming. The strongest philosophical section in the discussion is the reciprocity argument.
Is a problem is reciprocity. This concept is where I feel like the modern, predominantly white vegan movement has really lost the plot. So let me quickly tell a story to illustrate what I'm referring to. I read this years ago and
As someone who isn't very educated on whiteness in the veganism field, I would assume that I would assume that veganism tends to be a predominantly white thing just because white
That again, that's a racist take. You're involving race that has nothing to do with veganism.
people tend to be, well, they tend to have more access to more access to education and thus more access to I guess higher funds or higher amounts of
That's not true. If you have access to internet, you have access to any sort of education you want.
money, which obviously facilitates a vegan lifestyle.
Okay, so as someone who's not educated on white veganism implies that he's educated on veganism, which he is empirically not. He empirically knows absolutely nothing about veganism. Well, 90% nothing about veganism. He is not educated at all about veganism, period, by the fact that he thinks animal products aren't cancer causing and have IACM rates or what ACM is. Race becomes rhetorically foregrounded even though the core ethical framework is centered on harm reduction, not ethnicity. Veganism is about reduction where possible. It should go without saying any race that can't go vegan is not expected to. This is virtue signal.
I live a life of privilege that they could not even imagine. I have elders in my direct family line who passed down the skill of hunting. They did not pass it down for sport.
So, hunting traditions have nothing to do with today, nothing to do with industrial animal agriculture and from the average consumer.
Like I've never heard anything like this in my life.
Because he doesn't actually, this is the first time he's ever watched a vegan video, and he doesn't fact check anything he says, exactly like Joe Rogan.
Up again so gently to say that those families that are hunting deer and
No one is saying that. Literally, no one is saying that. This is a straw man.
living off of that meat for several weeks, the people that are using every part of the animal, I promise
You cannot you cannot exploit indigenous stewardship as a moral shield for industrial animal agriculture. What she's doing is actually racist. This part deserves serious treatment. Indigenous stewardship, subsistence hunting, and using the whole animal, maintaining ecological balance, and living in reciprocal relationship with land are not the same thing as industrial animal agriculture. They should not be flattened together. A family hunting deer to survive in a rural community is not the same thing as a corporation breeding animals into confinement systems for mass slaughter. A reciprocal ecological practice is not the same thing as anonymous supermarket consumption. The distinction is important, but this is also where anti vegan rhetoric often performs a bait and switch. It uses the strongest example of respectful subsistence hunting to defend the weakest reality of industrial meat consumption. Also, respect and love are completely different things. She said love animals, not respect animals. You can respect someone you don't love. If the argument is some reciprocal hunting practices may be ethically distinct from factory farming, fine, that is serious. But if the argument becomes, therefore, ordinary consumer participation in factory farming is ethically protected, no, that leap does not follow. You cannot use indigenous stewardship as a moral shield for animal agriculture. Those are different systems, relationships, scales, and ethical structures. Pretending they are interchangeable is not nuance. It is category collapse. It is dishonest and it is emotion as fact. Animals eat animals is not ethics. Another reoccurring argument is the appeal to nature, which is common in anti science and anti ethics rhetoric.
Eat other animals and we're animals, so it's just how it goes. Yeah, but then I think the vegan counter to that is that animals have to eat other animals and they don't know any better, whereas we do. And because of that, there's some sort of moral obligation to, if we have the opportunity or ability to not consume animal products, then
This is proving that he's lying, not just the Jenkins video, but this is proving that he's lying because he successfully acknowledges that it's not about perfection, it's about reducing harm where possible and practicable. So why does he intentionally frame everything as perfection, citing hypocrisy, which has nothing to do with animal agriculture? Yes, humans are animals. Animals eat animals. That is biology. But biology is not automatically morality. Animals also do many things humans do not treat as ethical models. Predators kill, animals fight. Some species practice infanticide. Some use coercive mating, some abandon the weak, and nature is not a moral instruction manual. The fact that something occurs in nature does not make it ethically justified for humans with moral agency, alternatives, and industrial systems. And even Jenke recognizes the vegan counterpoint.
counter to that is that animals have to eat other animals and they don't know any better.
This creates a direct contradiction with his earlier framing. He clearly admits here veganism is about less suffering, but the entire video he pretended veganism is about purity and perfection. That is the point. Humans are not lions. Humans are not obligate carnivores. In most consumer contexts, humans are not hunting because they lack grocery stores. Humans built industrial systems that confine animals by the billions. The deeper pattern is selective skepticism and whataboutism. This is a post hoc rationalization. Another important pattern is that many of the arguments used to defend meat consumption are post hoc rationalizations rather than the original reasons people began consuming meat in the first place. Most people did not begin eating factory farm meat because they carefully analyzed indigenous reciprocity systems, food deserts, or subsistence ethics. Those arguments often emerge after ethical discomfort appears. The original drivers are usually normalization, culture, convenience, habit, taste, family conditioning, and emotional distance from the violence itself, like a hitman. Vegan claims receive intense scrutiny. But what does love mean? What about Billy's hypocrisy, child labor, indigenous hunting, food deserts, AI, private jets? But normalized meat consumption does not receive the same consumption, nor does any of that have anything to do with veganism. The species hierarchy is mostly assumed. The consumer habit is normalized. The industrial system is acknowledged as horrible, then rhetorically bypassed. The discussion repeatedly treats veganism as though it requires impossible purity, while systems openly acknowledged as horrific are still treated as socially normal despite continued unnecessary harm. That is not consistent skepticism, or skepticism at all, really. It is motivated emotion based skepticism. Empathy and moral concern are repeatedly framed as a rational emotional performance, while emotional attachment to normalized behavior is treated as objective reasoning. The discussion dismisses emotionally driven ethical concerns while simultaneously relying on emotional normalization, discomfort avoidance, humor, and implication interruption to continue opposing the position. It is strict toward the argument that threatens comfort and loose towards the system that preserves it. This is why the discussion feels reasonable on the surface while still refusing to integrate its own admissions. The standard keeps moving depending on which conclusion they protect, moving the goalpost. The argument almost never stays still long enough for the implication to fully land. The moment ethical pressure rises, the topic pivots, humor appears, hypocrisy appears, semantics, edge cases appear, or emotional relief appears. This is why the discussion feels fluid while remaining philosophically and ethically unresolved, also logically. There is a valid critique of celebrity moralism. A wealthy celebrity telling ordinary people how to live can be out of touch, that is true, but hypocrisy discourse becomes a trap when it is used to avoid the original claim. The logic becomes Billy is inconsistent, therefore the vegan argument is weaker, but that does not logically follow at all. If Billy uses private jets, that may make Billy inconsistent, but it does not make factory farming ethical, nor does it have anything to do with veganism. If Billy uses AI, that may create a contradiction in her environmental messaging. It does not prove animal suffering is acceptable. Again, veganism isn't the same thing as an eco activism. If Billy continues with if Billy works with corporations that expose celebrity branding hypocrisy, it does not refute the harm principle. It has nothing to do with it. The actual structure is this: valid criticism of the messenger gets inflated into invalid dismissal of the message. That is why the hypocrisy section is rhetorically powerful but logically limited. It gives the audience emotional relief. It lets them say, see, she's not perfect either. But moral imperfection is not a rebuttal because no one is perfect. It is a distraction unless it directly changes the evidence, which it does not. It ignores the video he watched that stated veganism is about perfection, then continued framing it as about perfection. To be fair, the strongest anti vegan argument is not animals eat animals. It is not vegans are annoying, plants feel pain, or Billy is a hypocrite. The strongest anti vegan argument is that reality is materially complex. Food access is unequal. Some people have disabilities. Some cultures have reciprocal relationships with animals. Hunting systems are not the same as factory farming, and some vegan consumer systems still contain exploitation, which can be unavoidable. That is a serious argument, and it deserves serious treatment, but it does not erase the central issue. Most consumer meat consumption is not indigenous stewardship, not survival hunting, and not ecological reciprocity. Most of it is industrial, anonymous, mass produced, and hidden from view, but built on confinement, slaughter, and psychological distance. The strongest anti vegan arguments create nuance, they do not create absolution. The central pattern is not ignorance, it is acknowledgement while denying. The facts are not fully rejected, they are accepted just enough to appear reasonable. Then they are contained, quarantined, softened, and interrupted. The suffering is acknowledged, but not integrated. The industry is condemned, but not followed to conclusion. The necessity argument is conceded, then emotionally bypassed. The ethical pressure rises, then humor releases it. The implication forms, then hypocrisy redirects it. That is how cognitive dissonance protects itself. Not by saying there is no suffering, but by saying there is suffering, but, and then making sure the but never has to fully justify the harm. It's atypical moving the goalpost and changing the core argument points. Anti science is not always science denial. Anti science does not always look like someone denying every fact. Sometimes it looks like accepting facts selectively, then refusing their implications. It looks like accepting animal suffering but rejecting the ethical conclusion, accepting environmental harm but redirecting to celebrity hypocrisy, accepting that meat is unnecessary but treating veganism as a bad opinion, accepting human moral agency but appealing to animals eating animals. That is selective empiricism. Science is not just collecting facts that make you feel comfortable. Science requires following evidence through its consequences. Ethics requires asking what those consequences demand. HyperSanity requires noticing when someone accepts the premise but emotionally refuses the conclusion. This was never really about whether meat eaters can feel affection towards animals. Of course they can. The question is whether affection means anything when it consistently loses to unnecessary harm. This is never really about whether Billie Eilish is perfect. She is not. Nobody is. The question is whether her imperfections erase the suffering she's pointing at. They do not. This was never really about whether every person can instantly become vegan. They cannot. Access matters, disability, poverty, and food deserts matter. But those realities complicate implementation. They do not magically turn factory farming into an ethical system. The irony is that veganism is repeatedly criticized for failing to achieve perfection, despite never actually claiming perfection in the first place. The framework is fundamentally about reducing avoidable harm where possible, not achieving moral purity. The real issue is much simpler and harder to face. If you know animals suffer, if you know the industry is terrible, if you know meat is not necessary, and you still defend the system anyways, then the question is no longer about whether you have the facts. The question is, why do the facts stop mattering the exact moment they ask something from you? That is the contradiction. That is the cognitive dissonance. And that is why this discussion was never really about evidence or science, because the evidence was already admitted. The real struggle was whether the implications were emotionally acceptable. The contradiction feels emotionally normal because most consumers experience the system from outside the violence itself. The suffering is abstracted before the moral weight can fully register. My mom and I are abuse survivors, and we're both disabled, unable to work. If you want to do some objectively good, consider donating to the GoFundMe. As little as $1 can make a difference.